So it's both a blessing and a curse to be the first one to present, because you get to set the agenda, sort of. But also, the expectations are a bit, not as high when it's the first person. Right. So my name is Ilya Akdemir. I come from UC Berkeley. I'm a JSD candidate at the law school. My whole doctoral research project is on the application of these novel computational methods to answer questions that, when I was in law school, I thought about, wow, that's very interesting, but there's only like law review articles. There isn't really sort of a lot of quantitative stuff or like a lot of computational stuff going on. And this is work with Chris Kennedy, who's also from UC Berkeley, and Aaron Coolidge also. We're at the D-Lab, we're really excited about this data. We always say between ourselves that this is going to be the gold standard for all jurisdictions worldwide. It's just so good because it basically fulfills the promise of law that it should be really available to people who really want to like do stuff with it easily. This presentation is going to be about the estimation of historical trends in the US case law data using this method of textual embeddings, which is something that sounds complicated, but it's actually really intuitive. So now the problem that this research tries to answer is this idea of how legal terms actually change over time. This is a well-known phenomenon, and I will show it later on, some examples. And can modern NLP methods, the methods that have been developed in recent years, help us looking at these changes, tracking them, quantifying them, and so on. Now, before I get into the motivation part, I want to briefly go over the main results. This is all of the cases from the case law data up to 1980, and we divide them into 30-year to 20-year periods. As you can see on the x-axis, and we compare how a single, after aligning them, we compare how a word sort of moved in vector space. We find some interesting results using this method. We also compare the context surrounding a word in vector space over different time periods. I'll get into these results later on as well. This is based on a work by Hamilton, who basically took all the Google Books corpus and tried to see what sort of words changed over time. Things like awful. Back in the day, it meant awe-inspiring, but nowadays it means terrible. Now, the outline is going to be, I'll talk about the motivation, the question that we're trying to answer. Secondly, I'll talk about the methodology, this revolutionary method from 2013, Word2Vec, which is obviously being developed on, but this is the main sort of workhorse of our project. And we'll have some discussion on the results that we get. So, historical semantic change has been described by Crowley and Bowen in their book on historical linguistics as one of the least well understood topics in linguistics. Of course, to illustrate this point, let's think of the famous examples, the anecdotes from this domain. Now, in the 1670s, King James of England, apparently, when he saw this cathedral, this beautiful cathedral, he said that it's amusing, awful, and artificial. Back in the day, these words apparently meant different things, or else he wouldn't have used them for such a beautiful cathedral. We can obviously infer that amusing refers to some muses, and that's what it meant. Awful is awe-inspiring, artificial is artful, right? So if we actually look at this without any information from today's meaning of these words, would be sort of shocked. How is he such a mean person? Now, there's also other types of change in historical linguistics, things like the word cell, right? Jail cell used to be a common reference to a place to hold some person. Well, the meaning of cell did not change, but it expanded. It included things like cell phones and so on. And this is another sort of aspect of historical change that's basically some words are used for new things, and that would be interesting to see. It's not the same as the example above, because the example above is very sort of unintended kind of change. But the cell, the word cell below is, it represents a change in use of the word cell. Now, actually, this might seem like a very sort of socio-cultural question, and what does this have to do with law, right? Well, this is actually an ancient problem. Now, the great jurist Ulpian, one of the greatest classical jurists of Roman law, said the following in the Digest of Justinian. He said that the statute, Lex Aquilia, which deals with torts and damages, actually says ruperit, which means to break or rend asunder, but almost all the early jurists understood the word to mean corruperit, spoil. Right, this seems to be like a really tiny difference, but then he goes on to speak about this man who spilled another man's corn into the river. And he argued that, well, I did not break the corn asunder, right? I did not rip it apart. I did not do anything that falls under ruperit. So he says, I'm not liable. Well, he says, if we interpret the word ruperit as this was meant to be interpreted, right, as corruperit, then you're liable. So he finds him liable, right? Very sort of interesting, play on words. Well, this is not an ancient problem as well. U.S. Constitution, right? I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I'm sure a lot of you probably know this. The Eighth Amendment, right, prohibits the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment. Well, what does cruel and unusual punishment mean, right? Do we interpret it as it was interpreted back in the day, right? Or do we interpret it as it is interpreted today? What does it mean for something to be cruel and unusual? And so on, right? So we would, I highly doubt that we would have the same meaning of what they meant back in the day, but that's the way this plays out. Now, most of these examples are anecdotal. People sort of say, okay, look, this clearly shows that there's something going on. There isn't really a sort of quantitative methodology developed to sort of find words over time that change, or address any sort of changes that happen. Now, recently, in 2016, Hamilton, Leskovich, and Żurawski, they published this paper on tracking historical semantic change, and we're basically following that methodology and applying it to the case law data and using our domain knowledge in law to sort of look at what changes tell us. Now, before we go into that, let's sort of ask a somewhat deep philosophical question, but which computer scientists have an intuition about nowadays. Now, if we want to find the meaning of a word, right, there are generally two ways we can do this, right? We can look it up in a dictionary. We can say, okay, the word coffee that we're all drinking right now, it actually means this. It has the following features, right? And if we were to encode it, we would just have a one-hot encoding, right? Which is just in a document, it's represented by this vector, right? Now, another way, which is what Word2Vec essentially builds on, is this idea of relationships and context, right? And this is based on, rather than a dictionary definition, this is based on the idea of a concordance, right? Where we'll look at every time the word is used, and then we see, okay, maybe this word cosm had something to do with this thing dicat, right? And so on, right? Now, this is a theory in linguistics, which is called distributional semantics, right? That I'm sure all of you have heard of this. You shall know a word by the company it keeps, right? This seems like a sort of a linguistic insight, but lawyers actually, for a long time, knew this, right? When you read contracts, right, you interpret the terms in the contract in the context of the document, right? So it's not like some revolutionary concept, but the revolutionary aspect comes from the fact that you can actually use this method to represent words in the vector space, right? And that's the great part, and that's what basically Word2Vec does. So this paper by Mikolov from 2013, It basically takes all the words in the corpus and tries to find the meaning, not the meaning, vector representation, which we agreed is the meaning, right? By looking at every time the word is used and the context words around, right? So for instance, this is the training data, right? And the idea is you want to basically engage in a language modeling task, which is basically predicting a word given the other words. That's basically the continuous bag of words thing that they do. The other method is the skipgram model, which is you're trying to predict the context words around fox by just looking at the word fox. So one of them is obviously harder, but it's a very sort of intuitive algorithm. And the results are absolutely fascinating. These distributed representations of words actually are based, as I said, on this idea that similar words will have a similar meaning. And so once we actually apply this algorithm to the data set, we get the following. Let's say we want to find out the meaning of the word fraud from the case law data set, right? We can actually do this, right? We'll look at the cosine similarities between the vector for fraud and anything else that's most similar in the vector space, right? And for example, if we didn't know what fraud is, we'd sort of have an idea that's to do something with deceit, right? Or deception, right? Collusion, and so on, right? So because in the data set, the judges have used the word fraud with these words about collusion, trickery, and so on, right? The algorithm can capture that and represent it in a vector space, right? If we were to project it on a 2D, in 2 dimensions, right, would get something like this, right? Where, you know, they're sort of like together in the vector space. Now, what this allows is actually quite fascinating because instead of just dealing with words, we're dealing with vectors. So we can actually apply some simple linear algebra operations. This is just from the Mikolov's paper, right? If we take the offset between, so queen minus king would give us the vector for gender, right? And if we apply that same vector to the word uncle, right, we'll get, in the vector space, we'll get the word aunt, right? Man and woman and so on, right? Here, you know, we can use the same vector to capture the idea of plural, right? So king, queens, right? Now, because it allows us to engage in these linear algebra operations very efficiently and easily, this has been used to quantify semantic change. And how is this done? Now, there are 2 methods of basically quantifying, working with semantic change using these word-to-vec model. Now, the first is this idea of global change, where essentially we have this progressive problem, which is the idea that you want to fit 2 things together and compare the same dot. Now, let's say the triangle, the yellow triangle is the periods, is the word-to-vec model for the year 1800, and the little dotted triangle is the word-to-vec model for the year 1900, right? We're trying to fit them in and see how a single word changed in place over time, and we're trying to align them together. Now this gives us basically a score, and we use, and the established method is to use something called cosine distance, which is basically 1 minus the cosine similarity. Now, another change that we can look at is to actually sort of look at these context words surrounding a word and actually sort of infer things, and again using cosine distance sort of see how the word moved. In this case, you're not able to capture how a word moved over time. You can just examine the words that surround it and sort of come up with your own conclusions. Now, applying these methods, we get the following results as I've shown. Now, for instance, this is a pairwise cosine distance score. So, for instance, from 1840s, if you compare the pre-1840, all of the cases that we collected and we built a word-to-vec model, and you compare the word-to-vec model to the word-to-vec model in 1840, you'll get 0, right? There is no movement between 2 models that are of the same thing, right? But, for instance, if you go the next year, right, you get some movement, right? the next period is like 1870s to 1900s. Now the reason we're going with these somewhat like 30 years pre-1840 is because the algorithm and the idea of context dependence depends on a lot of use of words. So let's say if we just did for a single year like 1600s, right, we'll get like 100 cases. So that's not really good in representing a word like fraud, for instance. Now we can see that, for instance, the linguistic change for marriage, there was a lot of change when compared from 1840 to 1940s and 1960s in the y-axis. Now, if we add up the column, we get the total semantic displacement. Here's the, and in this way, we're able to find words that move over models, words that have change in meaning. These are the results that we got. Now, at first it looked like I didn't know what this was showing me, but the first word that it gave is, that's the word that moved most, a word like ulterior, right? Now, looking it up in the dictionary, as I said, right, we find that apparently it used to mean subsequent, right? But in the legal domain, it came to mean like ulterior motives, right? Some hidden thing. So that was captured really well in the data. The word plausible and plausibility, these are a bit more interesting as well. Apparently, they used to refer things like things that were worthy of applause as like plausible. So it made sense, but I'll have to we have to keep going on like looking at talking to linguists and so on, like which ones actually make sense or not, and this is how we sort of rank these ideas, but it captures something from the data. And even our simple separation into these periods actually brings us something. Now, the more interesting, in my view, results come from the applying the local change method, Hamilton's local change method. So, for instance, if you look at the word for loan from 1870s, these are the closest k-nearest neighbors for the word. Now, it captures the idea of plurality. It's somewhere close, borrowing, investment, and so on. The curious thing is this idea of usury, right? In 1870s, we can see that in the context of a word like loan, usury was more argued, or the judges wrote about it more. We see the sort of in 1900s, the idea of usury or usurious loans is sort of going down in the nearest neighborhood. And then in 1970s, it completely disappears, right? We don't even see it. It's somewhere like really far away. Now, what can we infer from this? Obviously, it makes sense that usury was a sort of an argument that would be brought up, and judges would actually write about it in their decisions. But it also shows that there's this sort of social change that happened in the US. And this is, I think, interesting from a historical perspective. Also from a legal practical perspective, right? You want to see how a word is moving over a couple of years. What are the words that are used in context, right? And you want to sort of see how it moves. Another example, and I have a couple, the word like marriage, right? In 1870s, 1900s, a lot of interesting words like intermarriage and intermarry, right? Obviously showing the sort of the historical discussions. I mean, the discussions that happened in history in the US that were sort of not very nice, right? And in 1970s, we see things like divorce, right? Come up a lot, right? In the k-nearest neighborhood. Now, this doesn't mean that the word marriage changed in meaning, right? But applying these ideas of some calculations of semantic change over time gives us the idea of the trends that happened over time, right? Final, not really final, but this example of subordination, right? Obviously, back in the day, it used to mean something to do with subjection and so on, right? But nowadays, it's all about mortgages, loans, subordinated debt, right, and so on, subordination agreements. Now, the discussion. So we applied the methods from diachronic word embeddings, which is the technical name. But the idea is you represent words in a vector space and you see how they move over time. In fact, just as a sort of story on how this came about, I was presenting this at this working group that we have in Berkeley, which is the Computational Text Analysis Working Group. And I was presenting like a year ago saying, you know, this is a really cool thing that should be applied to case flow data because it's like such an old problem. And then a couple of months later, I get an email, right? You know, maybe destiny, I don't know. But now there would be no excuses, right? All the people were like, hey, you know, you said you were gonna, you could do this, right? Well, there we go. We applied it. We see some interesting results. Words like ulterior, right? An interesting change. Now, some of you might say, well, one of the arguments could be, well, you know, you could just look at the dictionary and like a linguistic corpus and just, what's the point of looking at the case flow data, right? And we have some sort of theories on how to like, you know, do it into a publishable, you know, like a law review article, but something like judicial conservatism being reflected in sort of how these words change, perhaps comparing it to the embeddings that were made by Hamilton to see, you know, if culture moves first or like the law follows or so on. Another thing is these methods are absolutely sort of, even though technically they're sort of complicated, right? The application of these methods actually makes a lot of intuitive sense when we apply it to the data. And yeah, when a practitioner would look at this, let's say on a more recent stuff that we still have to include. By the way, the 1980s, pre-1980s, like 3,700,000 cases. After that, like it gets really computationally intensive. So we're still sort of working on like, you know, implementing for later periods. But I'm excited to see what it would bring about, and we're also hoping to share these, you know, embeddings as well, so that other people could look at, historians, sociologists, lawyers could look at how, you know, how judges would write about certain things and what the context has become. I am pretty much done. I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much. And just before I move on, I just want to say that this is absolutely an amazing data set. Like, it's definitely going to be the gold standard for all sorts of research on these subjects. Hopefully, other jurisdictions in the world will also, you know, adopt this method and try to sort of release this stuff for researchers and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. So we have a few minutes before we move on to our next presentation. I want to ask for your kind of yes and. What was the thing that you wondered about next from this? I'm going to start with a question though. Since you mentioned the work of cranking through the data and how there's still a lot as you get into past the 1980s, can you say a word, a very short word, about what tech stack you're using and any kind of resources that the community could offer that might make that easy?
The problem is, one of the problems is tokenization. So I'm not a computer scientist, but so tokenization is this idea that you want each word to be separate. So that really takes up a lot of memory. So I would probably suggest use like generator functions, which are more useful, memory efficient. I don't know if that's what you're asking, like tips and tricks.
Are there software packages you're using, or even like compute resources that you would need, or pre-calculated things that you would need? What would make it easier? So this
this is all based on this package in Python called Gensum, which applies this algorithm to data sets. And there's a great like tutorial and like methods of doing it. And when we get done with this, we'll release the code to the public as well. But it's nothing really there is complicated math involved in like aligning stuff, but It's literally not. It's pretty intuitive. Yeah, that's that's my.
Let me throw it out to the audience. In a tweet length question, what is your yes and? What are you wondering about next? What is type of research?
Yeah. Just you had a wonderful example with marriage. I'm wondering how you landed there. If you tried others, in your process.
Yeah. So in the breakout session, I can I have it like on the cloud, so I can show like any word you want that we can sort of do that. But marriage was one of the things on that list of 12,000 words that really changed a lot. So like changed a lot if we define change as cosine distance. So because if you add all this up, it's like something like 6.5 or something. So it's somewhere down there. But it's one of those words. Also, another thing on that point is that the next step for this project is to represent words instead of just single unigrams as and include phrases, because that's the interesting part. Things like First Amendment, cruel and unusual is like by itself. The word cruel is not really sort of capturing that idea. So that's the next step, and yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Questions?
Real quick, I'm curious how interesting, if interesting at all, are words that don't change, words that stay stable across long periods of time. That's
a great question. There is so the bottom of the table has least divergent words, and those words are like numbers. So they apparently were like there's like statutes that have been used. So I think we have to like remove the numbers. Although so there is like those issues, which is absolutely a great point. Now the problem is if we remove numbers, there is some information that's lost in the whole learning process. So it's like something we're like thinking about. But absolutely, the least divergent is like literally like a list of like 433 or like some statute that they kept using in the same context. Which is kind of cool as well.
We have time for one or two quick ones.
Someone else.
I was putting something.
Let's bring this one in.
I think this work is super fascinating. One of a yes and for you is to look not just at time, but maybe at different jurisdictions or states, and kind of taking a similar word and seeing what happens when bag of words for the contextual meaning of words, say in the South versus in the Northeast or in California.
That's I wanted to include that in the slides, but I was a bit skeptical because I didn't do any work on that. But that would actually that's definitely like the next step, and like even comparing like even decreasing maybe periods depending on trying to see like more granular sort of things like that. There's a lot of like stuff to do, but yeah, absolutely, that'll definitely make sense.
As a judge probably knows better than me, but there's some case in criminal law that turned on the fact that the word kick it is interpreted in Maryland very differently than it's interpreted in like Washington D.C. or New York. So like there are little words like that with like modern kind of slang that
there
is
is
really cool to check out.
There is like a regional.
I want a lawyer dog. It's a recent case. And was he asking, was it I want a lawyer comment dog, or I want a lawyer dog? And our courts determined that it was I want a lawyer dog.
Because language is different at the Supreme Court from everywhere else. Thank you, Nick, for demonstrating our yes and procedure. Everyone take notes, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Ilya, for going first.
Thank you so much. Thank you.